I am back with the results from my latest survey, and this was rating the solo Beatles albums as to which one was the best. Now, I started off with the top 6 that have been, for many, many years, the consensus best albums, I guess. We're going to challenge that a bit. And to do that, I came up with 7 criteria by which to judge. That's what I use to judge these 6. I encourage you guys, when you do your survey, to use the same criteria so we have a little bit of a level playing field. I realize some of these might be favorites, but it's what you guys think are the best. Now, I've had over 1,000 respondents take part in this survey, which is great because that starts to give us a little bit, at least consensus, well, among my viewers anyway, as to what is the best, and we can kind of discuss from there. And we're talking about over 60 different albums here. And I realized when I asked you guys to partake in the survey that many of you would know most of these albums or a good deal of them, and maybe some of you didn't. Some of you did let me know that in the responses. But I thank you all for giving it your best shot. So let's begin here. I've got my trusty computer here. I'm not in my desk, as you can see. I'm out on location, away from my desk, so I had to go to the plan B here. All right, so we had 6 albums to choose from for the main part of the survey. And I'm just going to start with the top vote getter. And this was All Things Must Pass. And this was a pretty comfortable lead as well. I'll put the actual numbers up in a moment. There's kind of a rating, a ranking as to the percentage of people that ranked it at 1. So All Things Must Pass was number 1. Band on the Run, number 2. Very close on the heels of Band on the Run was Plastic Ono Band. So those are the top 3. We got a John, Paul, and George. The 4th one is Imagine. And Imagine just barely beat out Ram. And as I was watching the results come in, Imagine was out ahead of Ram by a decent margin. And then Ram started creeping up and not only caught Imagine, but went ahead. And then in the last couple of days, Imagine retook the lead. So that is extremely close. Imagine and Ram virtually a tie. And then finally, Ringo was far back in the 6th spot, the Ringo album from '73. When you look at the numbers here, they're all pretty close. It's not like it was, 90% and then everybody else was in the back. But these albums are all considered pretty darn close. And I can't disagree with that because I always have a hard time deciding which one I feel is the best or even my favorite out of those. So this graph I'm showing you here shows All Things Must Pass with a score of a 4.46. Next being Band on the Run, 4.05. Plastic Ono Band, 3.79. All fairly close, but All Things Must Pass definitely out in the front. And then we have, look at how close Imagine and Ram were. I mean, Imagine beat out Ram by 0.02%. So now we're going to look at the write-ins. Now this was where I felt we're going to get a lot of good feedback as to what really are that next batch of great albums. We hear about the top 4 or so all the time. And this was very interesting, and I thought it would be interesting. So first of all, let's start with the top write-in getter. This was a surprise to me. Walls and Bridges by John Lennon. This by far and away was the most written in best album by the survey takers. Next we have 2 Paul McCartney albums. We have the McCartney album from 1970 at 51, 20 behind Walls and Bridges, and then Venus and Mars right behind it at 50. So Venus and Mars wasn't one I expected to see very high up on here. And though it's a good album, and unfortunately it always paled in comparison to Band on the Run, and people don't talk about it as much. But a lot of people rank it very high, so that was good to see. The next 2, we have 2 George albums, Living the Material World at 48, Cloud 9 at 48. So I'm also glad to see Cloud 9 there, although I don't rate Living in the Material World very high at all. And those of you who love that album would not like to hear my review of that one, but that was that rounds off the top 10 of all the vote getting in this survey. So Living in the Material World is ranked pretty high by you guys. And then Cloud 9 George Harrison's comeback album from '87, I think that one, as far as the criteria goes, I mean, that has just about everything. It's got a good flow. It's got very little filler. It has a big hit. It's got a secondary hit. So it ticks a lot of the boxes. And I think, I haven't listened to that one much in a while. Maybe a little bit dated. But I think if Jeff Lynne's production ever worked well, it's probably in that 86, 87 era, after which he sounded quite dated. Cloud 9 is an album that I was in college, and I remember my friend had bought that for me. It was on cassette, as a matter of fact. And she listened to that. And she wasn't a big Beatle fan either, but she got my mind set on you. Not one of my favorite songs. I was a little disappointed it wasn't a George Harrison original, but what we do have is the last #1 song by a solo Beatle, and that's going back quite a far ways, 1987. Actually, the last top 10 hit by a Beatle in the United States on Billboard anyway. Okay, next one, we got Double Fantasy John Lennon, and that's with 31 votes. Now, there was a lot of people qualified in the write-in section that, well, they're just kind of rating the John Lennon songs. To me, if you're going to talk about flow as a criteria of a very good album, that song never flowed for me because of the Yoko albums, the Yoko songs within there. I mean, it seems like two different albums to me. But Lennon really has some, talk about songs that stick in your head. 3 big hits on that album. And one of my all-time favorite songs by him, Watching the Wheels. Next we have Tug of War, 33 1/3, and the George Harrison self-titled album from '79, all right in there. Tug of War at 28. Again, that's kind of a similar way that I would have rated and judged Cloud 9. Tug of War, also a very big hit. Not a lot of filler on that album either. We have George Martin back in the production seat there, helping McCartney make some decisions on quality perhaps. And that album, I didn't think that'd be on here, but you guys rated it rather high. 33 1/3 and the George Harrison album, also those albums were starting to, George Harrison's popularity had been waning by that time, and those albums, though I feel are very solid, didn't quite get, they weren't as big of hits as some of the others. Okay, and then finally in this group of 10 is Flaming Pie, Paul McCartney, the first late period album by a solo Beatle. That's an album I always, of his later period stuff, and I realize it's not quite the 21st century McCartney stuff, but if you include Flaming Pie in that would be my favorite album by him from that later period. And even though it doesn't have any hits on it, it itself sold well. This album initially out of the gates did really well, and it's still considered one of his better albums. I've always been hearing that from fans for quite a long time. So out of those next batch of 10, we've got 4 albums by George, 4 albums by Paul, and 2 albums by John. So that's pretty evenly distributed, considering John took 5 years off really, and wasn't around after 1980, so not too bad. There was quite a variety of write-ins, and I want to let you guys know where these all fell, because it was all over the map. And with 60 plus albums to choose from, you're going to get a lot of variety. So let's start with Mr. McCartney. We saw these placements. So the next batch after this, after Flaming Pie at 21, was Chaos and Creation in the Backyard at number 13. So this is another one of his late period albums that I continually hear is a favorite among fans. And this album is particularly strong. The thing with some of these later McCartney albums, they lack a big hit, but typically these albums sold pretty well. And with Chaos and Creation in the Backyard, he did tour on that album. So he did what every good working musician should do, and that's work the album. And that's, I think, one of the reasons it got into so many hands, and people like it pretty much above every other late period album. So then we got Back to the Egg, 9, Flowers in the Dirt with 8, Wings at the Speed of Sound, 7, London Town, 6, Wings Over America, 6, and Red Rose Speedway, 4. So a lot of those 1970s albums right in that range, with Flowers in the Dirt also ranking relatively high compared to the 70s stuff. Yeah, Flowers in the Dirt is another one that's been always been kind of a sleeper. And that came off after a few bad years for McCartney, in my estimation, where, you know, it was kind of a transition period. And a lot of these, particularly the 70s albums, he's got kind of a flow to how he puts an album together that is rather similar from album to album. And maybe I'll go into that in another video on just McCartney, if the fans think they can take it. Okay, next batch of McCartney songs we got down to the nitty gritty here. McCartney 2 with only 2 votes, New 2 votes, Run Devil Run 2 votes, and all the rest of these with 1. Off the Ground, Memory Almost Full, Kisses on the bottom. McCartney 3, Driving Rain, Liverpool Sound Collage. And then finally, these got no votes. Egypt Station, Wildlife, Pipes of Peace, Give My Regards to Broad Street, Press to Play, the Russian album. Not a big surprise that those would be at the bottom. I thought we might get at least 1 or 2 votes for some of those, but we did not. All right, let's go over to George Harrison. We saw his top albums. One that I did mention that wasn't in that group of 10 was Brainwashed. And that wound up in the next best George Harrison album. And that's an album I'm really close to. And I think one of the reasons why, I know some people don't care for my reviews of solo Beatles stuff because they think I'm too harsh, but I think I'm a good critic because I'm not as close and not as emotionally close to some of these albums as some viewers may be or some collectors may be. This one, however, I was pretty close to. In fact, this is the only real Beatles solo album I listened to start to finish. It's Brainwashed. And the reason why, when it came out, it was given to me and I had it in my car on CD for a long time. And as many of George Harrison's songs do, they spiritually are uplifting for me anyway. And of all the solo Beatles, I listened to George Harrison the most out of the 4. And Brainwashed was a very welcome album at the time, a year or so after he passed. So we see that one ranked fairly high here with your votes as well. And then rounding off the George Harrison stuff, we have 4 for Wonderwall. Wonderful. 3 for Traveling Wilburys, although I don't think they would really apply because it's not a solo album for George, but 3 votes for the Wilburys. 2 for Dark Horse, 1 each for Bangladesh, Extra Texture, and Electronic Sound with Gone Troppo getting 0. So even Electronic Sound got a vote for Gone Troppo. Okay, let's jump over to John here. He hasn't got many to choose from, so we saw the top 2, and then we saw obviously Walls and Bridges, Double Fantasy. The next one being Mind Games at 14, Milk and Honey 3, Rock and Roll 1, Sometime in New York City 1. Fairly predictable. Walls and Bridges being, widely considered, I guess, the 3rd best John Lennon album out of what, the 8? So nothing very surprising there. And finally we go to the nose, Ringo. And unfortunately, Ringo only got 8 total votes, which didn't really surprise me. And he's got about 20 albums to choose from. Maybe 10 in like the 21st century, quite a lot. Those would be the least known, I would say. But here's what we got. We got Bukus of Blues at 2, Time Takes Time 2, Goodnight Vienna 2, and Vertical Man and Ringo the Fourth each 1. So we got Ringo the Fourth. We got a sick mind out there apparently with voting that as the best. So one little mention of Time Takes Time. A great, perhaps maybe the best overlooked solo album. I mean, the Beatles are so popular. All their solo albums get it going over through all these YouTubers and podcasters and people like myself. So it seems like no stone is unturned, but I would say Time Takes Time. If anybody's looking to try out a Ringo album, the 3 that matter most, I would say, are Ringo, Bukus of Blues, and Time Takes Time. I really think those are the best listening experiences, start to finish. And the thing about Time Takes Time, the All-Star Band was back in gear. He had quit drinking. He was cleaned up. He had several producers involved in this record, and they all seemed to be on the same page. And the sound sounded contemporary, but it was a bit of a throwback, a bit of a pastiche to a Beatles sound. So the first song from this album I heard was Way to the World. And I heard that on the radio. So this is a time when you could still hear Beatles solo stuff on the radio. The other song I heard on the radio was Don't Go Where the Road Don't Go. So that was sufficient enough for me to buy the album. Way to the World I always thought was not a rip-off of It Don't Come Easy, but they were trying to do an homage to that. And it was instantly recognizable as Ringo. And this album just doesn't disappoint. There is a little bit of filler on it, I grant you that, but I guess I just did a little review for this album. One to check out. Okay, one of the things I asked when I did the initial video talking about the survey was the criteria that I chose. I said, hey, if there's any other criteria that I missed, let me know. There was one very good option or very good idea that somebody put forth, and that was a category for production and arrangement. And I thought that was a good criteria to add as well, because although one thing that I steadfastly believe is that no matter how good of a producer you are, if you've got crap songs, there's not a whole lot you can do with it. But if you've got quality songs that needs better arrangement or production facility or skills, that could take the album to the next level. I mean, the album that comes to mind with production is Asia, Steely Dan, 1977, which is an amazingly produced album. Maybe some people might even say too slick. I would not. I would say the next Steely Dan album, Gaucho, might be a little too slick, but that's where you start talking about the rankings start to come in, you know. Sometimes, like the Plastic Ono Band, Phil Spector's production on that, which is almost anti-production, people like that. Contrast to that to All Things Must Pass, you know. So that might be a good criteria as well. Certainly, All Things Must Pass, the production on that is either loved or hated. So that may sway somebody's vote. The other thing I wanted to mention, this idea of having some criteria is the thing I like about it, is if you come up with criteria and then you apply this on the criteria, it's kind of the criteria's fault. You personally won't get blamed for it. You know, so one of the things that we see here a lot on YouTube is without criteria, it ends up being, well, what's your favorite? Which is not a bad topic either, but you can't have really consensus. That's harder to come by. If you're going to talk about the quality of something, you have criteria. That's how they deal with the greatest films ever made. This is an old exercise, and typically what they do there is you have experts that have been in the film industry that weigh in, and their reputations are on the line, so they can't exactly put something stupid down there because they'd be called out for it. So that's how you start to get some consensus, and that's what I tried to do with this exercise. And I got some people didn't care for the criteria. Here's one guy that said he called the criteria so limited, so strict, and difficult to find merit in. So I always have fun with these responses, especially when they don't offer any reasons why they think that or offer any other criteria of their own. So the comment section below is to offer that criteria and to say if I've got something wrong, if you think that if it's too stiff or too limited or too strict or without merit, the comments is the place to say why you think that. So it's a lot of, it's just a different way of thinking. It's difficult to take the emotion you might have for an album that's really important to you out of the equation. So taking the subjectivity out of it as much as possible is, I think, where you get some consensus, at least around these criteria. And this, again, is for pop music. I would have chosen different criteria for rap or for classical or for jazz or for blues. And that's how you start to narrow things down. And if some people find them too strict and want to just have it be open, anything goes, well, then it just becomes your favorite. That's all for today's video. Thank you to everybody who took the survey and contributed to the conversation. One of the things that I offer is a Patreon subscription that helps if you want to support this channel in a bigger way. And one of the things that allows me to do is pay for services like the survey. So I've done, I think, 4 surveys so far on this channel. There's more to come, and I really, this way I can refer, instead of using my opinion, say, well, this is what I think for these reasons, this is what the viewers of this channel think. And I think that carries some weight. And after curating you guys for about going on 4 years now, I'm very happy with the comments and your involvement in this channel. So I'll leave up some information about the Patreon thing. I am not in my natural surroundings. I've been out of town, and I've been delayed here out on the West Coast. So I can't wait to be back at my desk. I've got a Beach Boys series waiting for me. So that's the next thing you'll see here on Pop Goes the 60s.
Nightmares chase the dreams away. The cold night reflects the way you